Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is our study of Dao De Jing. We are on chapter 7. So we're going to be doing chapter 7. The format is that we will start by anybody who wants reading their favorite translation of chapter number 7. Okay, we will have some people reading it in Chinese. So choose any translation, and I encourage you to read it. All the translations are interpretations, so we'll get multiple interpretations, and then we are going to discuss it. Okay. This meetup, this series of meetup, has turned out to be far, far greater than what I had hoped, because this idea of focusing on a very deep text, which is very concise, using multiple translations and then discussing it in, deeply. And this being done by a community of people who are really deeply into Dao De Jing, the text itself, and are trying to apply it to their lives. I think it's something magical. Okay, so I think we have something really special going here. So what I want to do is, after covering the number 7, instead of going to number 8, what I'm going to do is that this is like an intermission. I want to try out something where people get to bring their deepest questions. So we'll put all the deep questions that you have now about Dao De Jing itself, the Taoist philosophy itself, on the table. And then we're going to discuss them. So it'll be like first half would be number 7, and the second half would be discussing these questions in breakout rooms among small groups. Okay, so I'll describe the second part. And the reason for it is that you get a lot of value by doing back and forth with a small group of people on deep questions. So I want to bring that element into these Dao De Jing meetups. All right, so first, let's go ahead and read the translations. Who would like to go? We are doing number 7. Folks, we've got, in order to speak, just go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat. Currently, we are simply reading the translations. First up is going to be Dave. Dave, go ahead. Dave, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Some people say I do best when I'm muted, but thanks for the hint there. Heaven endures, earth lasts a long time. The reason why heaven and earth can endure and last a long time is that they do not live for themselves. Therefore, they can long endure. Therefore, the sage puts himself in the background, yet finds himself in the foreground, puts self-concern out of his mind, yet finds self-concern in the fore, puts self-concern out of his mind, yet finds his self-concern is preserved. It is not because he has no self-interest that he is therefore able to realize his self-interest.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Next up is going to be Judith, Joe, Madeline, and Brian. Phil, you had unmuted. Would you like to go? Would you like to start by reading Chinese version of it?
No, I don't read Chinese.
You don't read Chinese. Okay. All right. So anybody who can read Chinese, you're welcome to do that. So it's going to be Judith, Joe, Madeline, Brian, and Eamon. Judith.
Okay, this is the Stephen Mitchell translation. The Tao is infinite, eternal. Why is it eternal? It was never born, thus it can never die. Why is it infinite? It has no desires for itself, thus it is present for all beings. The master stays behind. That is why she is ahead. She is detached from all things. That is why she is one with them. Because she has let go of herself, she is perfectly fulfilled.
Wonderful. Thank you, Judith. That was amazing. Next up is Joe. Joe, are you going to read Chinese?
Sure, why not? No, just
Go ahead.
actually, I don't know if Kevin, if you want somebody to read in Chinese,
Yes.
Kevin.
Kevin, can you go ahead, please?
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to take your turn. Okay, I'm going to read the Chinese first.
Kevin, can you speak into the mic?
Okay, it's better.
Much better.
Chapter 7. 天长地久，天地所以能长且久者，以其不自生，故能长生。是以圣人后其生而生先，外其生而生虫，非以其无私也，故能成其私。And I got a short translation. It's heaven is long, earth enduring. Long and enduring because they don't exist for themselves. Therefore, the sage steps back, but is always in front, stays outside, but is always within. No self-interest. Self is fulfilled. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Madeline. Joe.
Sure. This is the Wayne Dyer version. Heaven is eternal, the earth endures. Why do heaven and earth last forever? They do not live for themselves only. This is the secret of their durability. For this reason, the sage puts himself last and so ends up ahead. He stays a witness to life, so he endures. Serve the needs of others, and all your own needs will be fulfilled. Through selfless action, fulfillment is attained.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Madeline, followed by Brian. Madeline.
Yes, I have the translation by Jiafu Feng and Jane English. Heaven and earth last forever. Why do heaven and earth last forever? They are unborn, so ever living. The sage stays behind, thus he is ahead. He is detached, thus at one with all. Through selfless action, he attains fulfillment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madeline. Next up is going to be Brian, Amon, and Phil. Brian.
Okay, this is from DC Lau version. Heaven and earth are enduring. The reason why heaven and earth can be enduring is that they do not give themselves life. Hence, they are able to be long-lived. Therefore, the sage puts his person last and it comes first. Treats it as extraneous to himself and it is preserved. Is it not because he is without thought of self that he is able to accomplish his private ends?
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. Next up is Eamon, followed by Phil. Eamon.
Thank you. I'm reading from the Bill Porter Red Pine translation. Chapter 7. Heaven is eternal and earth is immortal. The reason they're eternal and immortal is because they don't live for themselves. Hence, they can live forever. Thus, the sage pulls himself back, but ends up in front. He lets himself go, but ends up safe. Selflessness must be the reason whatever he seeks, he finds.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Eamon. And folks, if you, even if somebody else has read the translation, you can go ahead and read it again. Next up is going to be Phil, followed by Mike. Phil. Phil, you need to unmute yourself.
Heaven lasts, earth endures. They last and endure because they do not live for themselves and thus can live forever. Therefore, the sage positions himself behind and yet stays ahead. He denies himself and so is preserved. Is it not because of his selflessness that he completes his own?
Wonderful. Thank you, Phil. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by Evanique. Mike.
This is from Charles Muller. Heaven and earth last forever. The reason that heaven and earth are able to last forever is because they do not give birth to themselves. Therefore, they are always alive. Hence, the sage puts herself last and is first. She is outside herself and therefore herself lasts. Is it not through her selflessness that she is able to perfect herself?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Evanique, followed by Krishna. Evanique.
Yeah. Yes, so mine is the Tao of Christ, a Christian version of the Dao De Jing. God is infinite and eternal, never born, never dying. God has no desires and is therefore available for all creatures. Christ takes the lowest place and is exalted to the highest place. He is not attached to earthly things and therefore enjoys all things. He empties himself and is thereby complete.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Krishna Das. Krishna, go ahead.
This is the Ursula Le Guin. The chapter is called Dim Brightness, and it says, heaven will last, earth will endure. How can they last so long? They don't exist for themselves, and they go on and on. So wise souls leaving behind move forward, and setting self aside, stay centered. Why let the self go? To keep the soul needs.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Krishna. All right.
Ursula Le Guin is one of my heroes, by the way. Sorry.
Wonderful. Sam, would you like to read? Okay. Thank you. All right. Next up is what we're going to do is now we're going to start discussing it. It has two parts, but it's short enough and it's kind of one thought really. So you can talk about, let's talk about this as a whole. So if you'd like to say, okay, what do you get from it? What does this mean to you? What do you learn from it? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to speak about this poem as a whole. Lisa. So it's going to be Lisa, Dave, and Joe. Lisa, you need to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. This strikes me as being very Buddhist, this part, having to do with selflessness. Seems to be about charity, about by giving one is filled. So that would be, to me, the whole of this part is probably more Buddhist than other parts that I've read.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Phil, followed by Dave, Joe, Evanique, and Maritza. Phil.
Yeah, I was struck by this one, how he uses terms that are kind of emotional. In other words, it's about feelings, first, let's say, lasting and enduring. That seems to be a human feeling dimension. It doesn't talk about eternity so much as endurance. And forever, I guess that's a little bit more, but that's a measure of actually time in a way. So I was puzzled in a sense by the fact that he uses so many sort of emotional and I would say human terms, which he, I think, must intended to do. But he doesn't actually go into parsing out what humanity is, it really remains a kind of like a general guidance because of your last, your first. And so it also ends up being kind of a kind of selflessness, but it's often kind of selfish. I mean, I understand that that's a paradox, but I wonder whether that isn't is self-limiting because I don't want to get too deep into this because it would verge on a kind of criticism in a way, but it just seems to me like if you're going to use this kind of language, is what what we call, I'll put in quotes, more primitive and earthy language rather than a kind of abstract and distant language, then it seems to me you should begin to parse the emotion that's in it a bit more than just sort of saying it in kind of a generality and a vagueness.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Next up is going to be Dave, Joe, Evanique, Maritza, James, and Kevin. Dave, what did you get from this poem?
Thanks, Rakant. My translation is by Robert G. Henricks. And as I mentioned before, it's a very scholarly work. And there is a note for this chapter, as there has been some of the other ones. The opening lines might have or might make more sense if the reader knows that an early Chinese saying about heaven and earth was that heaven covers and earth supports. They cover and support the 10,000 things, so they live for the sake of other things. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Evanique. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I see this as this is probably one of the more straightforward ones, but I really liked it a lot. I think it's telling us to detach ourselves from our ego. But if you can contrast that, the interesting part about it is that he's also telling us what's sustainable. And if you contrast this with desires, that our desires are insatiable, that those are not sustainable, goods and goods for our own needs only, or more money or more power, whatever it may be, these things aren't satisfying, these aren't sustaining. And I think that there's, all your needs are fulfilled through virtue, and virtue is its own reward. And so I think that it's a very powerful and simply stated verse. And it's that this is a renewing process, that being selfless is renewing in its own right. And so I think that there's a lot of powerful things there, but I see it as a pretty straightforward.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Evanique, followed by Maritza. Evanique.
Yeah, Joe stole my words. I was going to say, with this verse, it is about selflessness, but I look at the first part where it says, God is infinite and eternal, never born, never dying. He doesn't worry about the things that human beings worry about. Like we worry about dying, we worry about how we're going to live. If we're not focused on ourselves, we notice that the earth is here to support us. And it's going to provide for our needs. And if we look at it that way, and we look at how can we fulfill some other people's needs, if everybody looked at it that way, then our needs would be fulfilled, just because we're looking out for each other. So I think it is partly looking at it from a spiritual perspective. It's like, if you look at it as like if we all supported each other and didn't worry about living or dying, or somebody having more or somebody having less, or being better or worse than anybody else, especially in the second part where it says Christ takes the lowest place. In the Bible, it talks about how he was born in a manger. He was poor. He wasn't, the Jews didn't see him coming because he wasn't rich. But he had all the true treasures in the world because he wasn't worried about that stuff. He was just worried about, how could I support man? And it goes back to other chapters where it talks about leadership, where they say leadership is about serving others. I think that actually goes ahead. So I'll stop there because I've been reading a little ahead and I don't want to do that, so I'll stop there.
Sure. Wonderful. And folks, feel free to read ahead. There is no suspense here. It's all one story. It's one philosophy. And I think everything kind of builds on itself. I find it easier to kind of just let it flow over me multiple times through multiple translations, through audio, through reading. So thank you. Thank you, Ebony. I always like, the angle that you bring from the religious base. Next up is Maritza.
For this poem, it's, what strikes me, it's actually one of my favorite Spanish translators is Antonio Rivas, and the angle that he brings to it is, instead of heaven and earth, he talks about nature, and he says, that he tells us that nature.
Can you do us a favor? Can you read this like Spanish translation, maybe like verse by verse, and then talk about it, so that way we get a flavor of it.
It's shorter than the a lot of the other ones. So this one is the first. It only has 5 lines. So the first line is: La naturaleza es eterna debido a que carece de conciencia de sí misma. So what it says is, nature is eternal because it is lacking a consciousness of itself. De este modo, el sabio, and it says, and as such, the sage, se sirve a sí mismo en último lugar y se encuentra atendido, serves himself in the last place and finds himself attended. Observa a su cuerpo como accidental y encuentra que resiste. Observes his body as accidental and yet finds that he can persevere. Debido a que no atiende a su ego, este se encuentra satisfecho. Due to the fact that he does not attend to his ego, this one finds himself satisfied. So it's a little bit different from some of the others, but this one is my favorite because it seems to me that what it's saying here is, it's this, like, we so often as humans fall into the trap of trying so hard to attain these things that in the grand scheme of things don't have as much importance. And here, what I hear in this poem is just a very simple admonition to kind of let go and let things take the natural course. I'm reminded of the references in other poems to the water, and how the water, it just flows, it keeps going, it doesn't care. It's just going to find a way, it's going to keep flowing, and it's going to do what it does because it's water and it flows. And in this poem, what I hear is us being told that we should attempt to do that. And it's done by giving us examples of, the ways in which it could potentially be done. And they're like, they seem esoteric and abstract, but it's because what he's really trying to say to you is, don't sweat the small stuff.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maritza. Jason, welcome back. So Jason, what is your take?
I just want to ask a question to Maritza. How does the Spanish version translate the sage here in this part? The first part talk about the heaven and the earth, and second part talk about the sage. I didn't get it. Yeah. How does Spanish translate the sage?
For this translator, he prefers to use nature instead of heaven and earth. So in a lot of his translations, he uses where you find heaven and earth, you'll see here nature. And for the sage, we call it the wise man.
Okay,
or the learned man.
Okay, so it consistently use a wise man instead of
and
sage.
it will be the sabio.
Okay, got you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Next up is going to be James Kevin and Madeline. James.
Yeah. The first part is talking about the Tao, which consists of heaven and earth. And that is eternal and immortal. And it does not give itself life. But because it does not give itself life, it has long life, right? It's eternal. And so that's the kind of the metaphysics of the Tao. And then the sage is able to understand that. So he emulates this wisdom of the Tao, and also practices the truth of selflessness. And so by being selfless, he's able to attain the ultimate sense of who he is, the higher self. And yeah, that's how I interpret it.
Thank you, James. Next up is going to be Kevin, Madeline, and Eamon. Kevin.
Yes, thank you. Lots here treat the universe, life, and society as a whole. And by the first is 天长地久. That's the idiom in Chinese. Is described like a marriage and a relationship that's long forever. Here, then below is about the life self, altruism versus self-interest or selfish. That's another perspective to understand how do you contribute a little. I'm self, how consider myself first. So if before you doing that, here saying treat others first, then you are actually ahead of eventually. So it's yin and yang. If you let's consider yourself first possible, you are last. I'm pause here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. Next up is going to be Madeline, Eamon, and Phil. Madeline.
Yes, two things. One, I noticed that this poem contains basically two of the three elements that are usually discussed in the Tao. The first half is the nature of the Tao itself, and the second part is how we are to live in accordance with the Tao. In mine, the penultimate line says he is detached, thus at one with all. Something about the description of the sage in this one reminds me of chapter 5, the one where we have the discussion about the straw dogs and the detachment of the sage in relation to other people, and I guess to the 10,000 things, is kind of the relationship of the Tao to that of the straw dogs.
Thank you, Madeline. Next up is going to be Eamon, Phil, and Judith. Eamon.
Thank you. As I'm looking over this and as I'm listening, one of the things I'm reminded of is in my training to read text from the 100 Schools period, one of the most profound things that was shared with me and was impressed upon me was to remember that these were written to endure a time of war. These texts were written as words of advice, words of guidance, words of direction for kings, for warlords to be able to not succumb to the privation that was everywhere in the time of the warring states. So when I read this text, the overarching theme is one of modesty and selflessness, but the idea that the model is provided by nature, that it is selfless and altruistic without preference, and that this is what a leader needs to embody if they're going to survive all the tumult that is around them. That's where I see sort of the both sides of the coin, as it were, from why it's discussing what the nature of the Tao is and how the sage, excuse me, is the model of that. And by default, the good leader should try to be a sage leader. And this will be your one chance to escape sort of being subsumed in a time of war.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eamon. This is great comments. I really appreciate that. And welcome back. Jason, followed by Phil and Judith. Jason.
Oh, yeah, I just have a quick comment on Eamon's talk about it's a political advice to the ruler. Yeah, I think that I also read in this way. And I would suggest everybody pay a little bit attention on each chapter. Most of them, they start from metaphysics, talk about heaven, talk about nature, then go to the sage, okay, which is the ruler, of what the ruler have to do, or sometimes it's the role model. And then the last one talk like selflessness. That's kind of, you can see it's an advice to the ruler, just like Amon said, but we also can take it as advice to everybody as today's reader.
Wonderful, thank you. Phil, you're next.
Yeah, I mean, I remember last time I criticized it because the sage, to me, fell down a notch in my evaluation. And if you look at the Tao, I mean, you could see the Tao could either be one or the other, but the yin yang symbol is actually something that curves around each other. So it's dynamical. It has something to do with the tension between the two. So on the deepest level, it would be the nature of the limited with the unlimited. The unlimited is all there, but the limited is individual instantiation of the unlimited. Okay, that's one tension. Because I asked, like, which nature? And that seems to me like, in a sense, the material nature to a certain degree. Now, it goes beyond that, but then I said, life is a different kind of nature. It's about being and not being, kind of survival in a sense, if you put it in a very simple sense. The tension between being and not being, we're driven in terms of life, and that expands to all life, is that it wants to be, but it always exists in the state of non-being as well. But there's a third level, which is kind of human nature, which has to do with the relationship between the known and the unknown. Okay? And I think he's a bit passive in that. That's why I mean he's sort of stuck in kind of like in this level, you would say maybe the metaphysical level or something. But in fact, human being has to do with how do we come to know in a vast universe of unknown, the vast infinite unknown, okay? And it seems to me, it boils down to a certain degree to question and answers. Because if it remains endless questions, then it is on a very deep level, the way beings should be. But on the other hand, in terms of existence, you have to have some answers in order to also to be. So I think he was not sympathetic enough between the human nature, because human beings have this special gift or curse of knowledge, of knowing. If you go back to the Bible, he ate the apple of knowledge, right? He actually didn't eat the tree of life, but nonetheless, that's the case. And so in a sense, he sort of left it in this sense. I kind of think of when I think about this, it's left to government, and maybe that's why he abandoned government, because he couldn't deal with having to deal with these details of answers, how you're going to do that. And you can't sort of give this like, oh, just to be or not to be, or I mean, like, you can't just do that. So in a sense, he sort of backed off. Maybe that's why he backed away from government. And what? Confucius took over and gave some answers and it became a kind of a soft tyranny. Or Plato took over and became a sort of hierarchical government. So in a sense, I think of, for instance, our Constitution, you have laws which are more specific, then you have the Constitution, and then actually it's a higher level, you have the preamble. And if you want to break down the preamble more, it's really about justice, like do the right thing. Oh, yeah, okay, that's good. But what the hell is the right thing? You know, and in the instantiation of individuation, you have to give different answers to different things. And he just didn't want to bother with the details. You have to also give the details in a sense. And I think he was either bored or he could deal with it and he withdrew. It's a withdrawing mentality that he had to face up, that he also had to deal with human nature in institutions, that he has to somehow deal with that tension between being and not being, you know, certainty and uncertainty and all that. And I think that's where he failed, because he actually, in a way, did not live up to the Tao itself by exposing the infinite existing in the finite and the finite reaching for the infinite.
All right, Phil, that is a very profound comment. I mean, I will approach it another way. Yasuhiko, who was here, who talked about this, he talked about the West and the East. And if you look at the West is very good at naming things. It is actually superb at naming things. Science is based on naming things. Writing is the tool for naming things. And it allows for, it is the thing that makes possible the industrial civilization, explicit laws, constitution, structure. We're talking about the, you know, Jefferson and Madison. Jefferson is kind of saying, okay, what should be? It's kind of, he's capturing the metaphysical vision of what should be. And Madison is actually coming up with the structure, naming the structure of how do you actually implement that in a constitution and in law. And it is true, I think that, I mean, this is my personal opinion, that Lao Tzu is focused on metaphysics, and he understands epistemology at a very high level, that naming always has to speak to the unnamed. It has to, that is, unnamed is a standard that you have to go back to. You have to look at existence again and again and again, and not get enamored by whatever names or whatever ideas you currently have. He gets that. And that's a very crucial base. But what the West does is that it actually develops kind of the naming tradition in a different way. I'm not familiar enough with Confucius, but he seems to do that as well. That the naming tradition, which actually names are the father of 10,000 things. So it's not just names, but it's the specific things that we make, all the human institutions and human artifacts. So great observation. Thank you. Thank you. Let me see. Next up, it's going to be Judith and Alvaro. Judith.
Yeah, so I find it very interesting that, you know, depending on the translation, the words just give a different feeling. So I'm reading mine, so I'm getting a feeling, but if I map somebody else's, then it creates a different ideas in my mind. So my Stephen Mitchell translation never uses the word selfless. And the other thing is, you know, I understand that I should be taking this in the context of, you know, when it was written, and maybe it was written for a leader and advice, but when I read it, I take it as advice for myself. So, and mine, like a lot of them say sage, mine says master. So I think of the word master as like, I'm the master of myself, and this is how I should be. So again, in the first part, what struck me is, so he says, why is it infinite? It has no desires for itself. Thus it is present for all beings. And then in the second part, like mapping to that, it's saying, you know, the master, she is detached from all things. That is why she's one with them. So what that made me think about is that, you know, sometimes we're so busy because we're not the way we are people, and we're doing things and we have ideas and we're creating things and we're attached to all these things. But when we, for a moment, you know, will release that attachment, that is when we can be most present for ourselves. And then, you know, when it says that is why she is one with them, is like when you release your attachment to your ideas or what you have in mind or what you want, you just let it all go, then you can be most present for other people too. So that's how I took all of that, like how I can use the Tao's wisdom to, you know, find ways to live more in line with it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Judith. That was great. Thanks. Next up is going to be, let's see, Alvaro, James, Sun, and Paul. Alvaro.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. I just wanted to comment on the fact that.
Can you go ahead and speak more into the mic?
Can you hear me better now?
Much better.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity. I just wanted to make some comments with regard to text, and I noticed that there were some comparisons being made with other texts. So I don't want to make a conclusive remark, but just some highlights that came to my mind as we're reading it. The first one being that when we compare it to the Bible, I think it's really the first thing that we should notice is that it is mentioned in heaven and earth, but at no point is mentioned in hell. So that I thought that was really interesting. And even though I see a lot of similarities with the Bible when it speaks about the sage or the wise man that we can find in wisdom literature, we can also find that in Stoic literature. So I do notice a lot of resemblance with our literature, but it's like I feel it is touching on certain subjects, but it's not as strong as our literature. So it mentions heavens, it mentions earth, but it doesn't mention hell. So it gives the impression that you know, there is no condemnation or
I think in Tao, the heaven refers to the sky. It's not the same. The heaven concept is not the same concept as in Western religion, as best as I understand it.
Yes, of course. Thanks for that comment. I just want to make clear that I'm looking at it from the Western perspective because that's what I've been exposed to. But that's the first thing that comes to my mind. Mm-hmm. And also when it speaks about the sage, I would think about the sage as a person that is being righteous. What happens to the person who's not a sage, right? So if hell is not mentioned, what happens to that person, right? Who is not behaving as a sage? I do see similarities with Stoic literature again when it says put self-concern out of mind, at least in this translation. I think that it's very much tied to Stoicism and psychology nowadays. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is that I just comparing it to maybe Machiavelli, I do feel that it is really stripping away any interest from the person. And I don't remember who was the person who was mentioning that this was written for rulers. If I was gonna see this from a purely spiritual perspective, I feel that this is advice worth following, but maybe from a more Machiavellic perspective, I really see that somebody who follows this and is in a place of authority would be maybe in big trouble.
Thank you. It's clear in terms of the advice that he gives to the ruler is to act in accordance with the nature of people, which is very different from kind of this top-down kind of a structure, which many people in the West, including Machiavelli, are trying to argue for. So it's a very different notion of a ruler. It's kind of a ruler who rules least by working with the way in which the people naturally are going. So thank you very much for those comparisons. Next up is going to be James, Sun, and Paul. James.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I see this as a counterpart to the social philosophers, philosophies like Confucius, and like people who are in society and trying to, Plato, trying to build a society based on reason, based on their ideas of what is right and wrong, and so forth. And it doesn't leave much room for the individual to develop, to understand himself spiritually. So Lao Tzu is offering a way to find yourself, outside of, not outside, but maybe, in a society where you have, which allows for individual development without social coercion and social dogma and so forth. And so it's a very different from the kind of Platonic or Confucian ideas of social, structures and so forth. And so he's talking about, more of an individual person interested in philosophical self-understanding and a higher sense of meaning in a natural environment, getting close to who you really are. And I think what he means by nature is getting close to who you are as a person, and not be a product of your social determinism. Yeah.
Excellent points. Thank you. Thank you, James. Next up is going to be Sun, Paul, and Evanik. Sun.
Hi, I found the Korean translation so I can read.
Please do.
Okay, it says 하늘은 영원하고 땅은 오래다. 천지가 영원할 수 있는 것은 스스로 살려고 애쓰지 않기 때문이다. 그러므로 영원히 살 수 있다. 성인은 자신을 위해 머물게 함으로 앞서고 자신의 이익을 떠나 잊음으로 실은 자신이 거기에 존재하게 되는 것이다. 그것은 사사로운 욕심이 없기 때문이다. 사심이 없기 때문에 자신을 성취할 수 있는 것이다. So my understanding is, as life is our school, that all the nature can be our school. And for this chapter, the sky and the earth is the teacher for us. And the reason why they can ever last is because they are, they don't thrive for themselves. So what we can learn, what everybody can learn from sky and earth is stand by ego, selflessness, or strive beyond self-benefit or desire. And that's how we can all survive together. And that's, I don't think this is really like materialistic matter. It's all also perceive things, how we understand the things without putting my ego in front of everybody. That's
Wonderful.
it.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Jason, followed by Paul. Jason.
Yes, thank you, Son. I don't understand Korean, but I can hear your tone. And let me ask you a question. Do you feel the literature achievement, like the language is beautiful? I don't know, do you in the Korean reading? Son, that's the question.
I don't know how to answer that.
So do you feel it's like, because I try to make my own translation, and then because all the translation, they lost the tone, lost because they use a very good parable, sentence. Okay, so it's like a point, and then all the translation, they lost the flavor. So, but when I hear your reading, I just feel the tone is like, because the Korean is very close to Chinese. I believe that's the reason.
So actually, my Korean translation is right below Chinese chapter. So
Okay.
no.
That's the reason, I believe.
Yeah.
Can I read my own translation?
Please.
Because after know the group for a while, and then I kind of like, figure out what would be based on my understanding, what would be the way people use today's language to translate it. So that's what I'm going to do. I put this one in 3 sections. Okay, the first section talk about metaphysics, that's heaven and earth. Second part talk about the sage. We can see as a role model, as a ruler. And the last part is advice to the ruler, or basically to you, to everybody. So I'm going to do the first part. Heaven and earth can last forever. What's the secret? Because heaven and earth does not strive for itself. That's the first part. Second part, follow the logic. Therefore, the sage staying behind the group to lead the group, attaching to nothing to survive. And the third part, because the selflessness, so you can achieve self-actualization. That's I try to make it
beautiful.
As a try to make it the same words, and then try to use today's language, make it close to the original words. So yeah, thank you.
Jason, that was amazing, because it actually speaks very directly. It speaks.
Yeah, I try to find between the Chinese meaning and the group. Okay, our group, the meaning, and try to find the middle way. So that's what I try to do.
Excellent, because what happens is that the original Chinese is highly metaphoric. It has metaphors.
Especially that's the ancient one. Okay?
Yes,
the
ancient.
To today's Chinese. And
yes.
I think I look at the internet, I can see hundreds of different kinds of translation, depending on who you are. Okay, they look at it in different. For example, Buddhism. Okay, they make their own translation, and a lot of religious nothingness, emptiness, this kind of flavor coming out. So I'm not sure it's right or wrong, but that's
wonderful. But thank you very much, Jason. That was fantastic. Next up is going to be Paul. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to specifically kind of congratulate Phil on his comment, quite a while back now, but it taught me something that I like to think about how we approach a book like this, which is that I think Franklin, a few weeks ago, I think it was Franklin, said something about how the book is like, to him, it's alive. Like he has a question and he opens to any page randomly and it will answer the question. Like it seems uncannily alive. But my point about Phil's comment is a book like this can stand up to anything a student will say and be ready to have the student learn from it in a way. So if Phil was walking with that actual teacher and he said, you were just mailing it in that day and you didn't even say right what a sage really is. And it's like, you don't even understand doing and being. The book can handle that. You know what I'm trying to say? So it's like a book you can walk with and take as a whole and be able to go all the way with those kind of comments, and it can stand up to it, and then you just keep walking with it and see. So those are my thoughts, and thank you.
That's wonderful. I mean, that's what kind of great philosophical works or great poems do.
Yeah,
because it's like all these 81 things are like different mirrors, if you will, and you see yourself in the mirror, and every time you come to it, you see different things. So it's very, very powerful. Again, Yasuhiko was saying that, you can use this almost like the I Ching. You can pick a poem, you can just, in the morning, just pick up a random poem and say, okay, how does that speak to me? What does this mean to me? What is it saying about my life? Because it is philosophy, it is deep philosophy, and everyone will have implications for you, and it will be a fresh implication because it's that randomness, kind of surprises you, because you tend to think in a set way about your life and about your problems. So it's a way of kind of breaking the habit, but not just arbitrarily interrupting it, but interrupting it with this deeply resonant philosophy that speaks to many parts, deep parts of you. And you respond to that, and gives you an opportunity of changing, making a slight change. So thank you. Next up is Evanique, followed by Brian. Evanique.
Yeah, going back a little bit to Alvaro's point where he was talking about the Tao doesn't really seem to talk about consequences like the Bible does. And in a sense, I agree with that it, like for a Bible, it is a very defined thing. It's like heaven or hell. If you're good and you follow the rules, you get to heaven. Except when you look at the Gospels and how Jesus Christ talked, he said, love one another as you love yourself. That goes above all things. Some people call it the golden rule. And I think in that sense, I think what Christ and the Tao have in common is that they're like, if you're not loving everyone as you love yourself, then you're going to suffer for it personally. Like there's going to be a personal hell. And it's so hard with the Bible because some of the Bible is allegory and some of the Bible is stories, some of the Bible is parables. So some of the things like the weeping and gnashing of teeth could be seen as like a story or a parable as compared. And physiologically, like if you notice if you're angry all the time, you clench your jaw, and that's kind of like a gnashing of teeth or grinding of teeth. So it's true, and then you got to look at it from a different way. And just one thing is like the Bible, you got to look at it too. Is the books that were chosen to go into the Bible were picked by a governmental council. It's called the Nicene Council. And so the way they were made, it was almost like a book used to govern people. So of course there had to be emphasis on, well, if you don't do it like this, then you're going to go to hell. But I don't think that is the intention of Christ. It's just my interpretation at this point. But to me, my interpretation is that it's not as literal as people take it. So just a thought.
Thank you. I mean, we would love to pursue this. We're starting a series on the psychological meaning behind Bible stories this Thursday. It's based on work of Jordan Peterson. There is a series on that, and we are starting with the idea of God, and that's going to be on Thursdays. And this is only in our main meetup, which is the 52 living ideas, which I have put in there. So if you're interested, we will do that. I mean, we're going to study both of these separately on their own terms, because I think there are kind of differences and similarities. And it's important to see both of them. And we look forward to kind of going through that. Hopefully we will add the Indian text to that also, like Bhagavad Gita. And then we will do this comparison between Dao De Jing, Bible, and Gita, and then compare that to kind of philosophy, because these religions these were kind of the earliest capturing of some of the core ideas of metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, aesthetics, all of it. That's what they were capturing in a very different form. And so we look forward to this adventure. So thank you for being there with us on this adventure. Next up is going to be Brian. Brian.
So I'm going to click on a different web. I'm going to open my web browser. Can everyone still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm looking at the text here. I want to focus on the second half of it, where he talks about the master or the sage putting herself last. I think there's 3 couplets in here. The first is the master puts herself, the other thing is I've learned from all these translations that the words are, all the words are very good in some sense, but the original text, and so these translations are somewhat evocative, so I don't feel really bound by the exact text. The master puts herself, that's what this says, the master or sage puts herself last and finds herself in the place of authority. That's the first one. The second one, she detaches herself from all things, therefore she is united with all things. That's this translation. And then she gives no thought to self, she is perfectly fulfilled. The second of those couplets, it would make sense to me if they were phrased, let's say I derive a certain meaning from it, if it's phrased differently. Instead of saying she detaches herself from all things, is that she unites, she is not attached, well, maybe this is good the way it is, but she is not attached, she does not attach herself to anything. She does not attach herself to anything. So there's no intentional identification or affiliation with any one thing. And then the next line is, therefore she is united with all things. And to me, that means that she is open to everyone else or all other things identifying and associating with her. Because she has not excluded or precluded that association, that active step from others by some kind of active association or identity on her part. She doesn't identify with anything in particular, and therefore all things can identify with her. And that leads to the second or the last couplet. She gives no thought to self. I might say that also maybe she gives no thought to identity. I'm not quite sure what, self can have so many different meanings, but she gives no thought to identity. And to me, the identity here means an association or affiliation with others. And so the last couplet ties in with the second that I just talked about. And then therefore she is perfectly fulfilled. She lets others identify with her. So it's a life that's really built on fulfillment through relationships with others, and she's made herself, her capacities are available to everyone, and all are free to take advantage of it. And in doing so, they identify with her. I just thought that was a very beautiful idea that I got out of the way I read that text.
Thank you, Brian. Great observations. Next up is going to be Jason, Phil, and Lisa.
Yeah,
Jason.
I'd like to comment. Thank you, Brian. Your observation. I think that's the very difficult part, to translate, because you mentioned the couplet, the last six. Actually, the last how many? 3 sentences or 3 pair of sentence, and they use the words. Okay. They are totally opposite. So the first thing they talk about, stay behind, so you can ahead. That's I use word translation. That's why we get the leader, something. So it's the Chinese word is behind, stay behind, so you can be ahead. You are they call it the detach. Okay, so you can exist or attach. Okay, so attach, stay in the world. And the last one is the most difficult one, because selfless, that you can have self. So all the translation, the difficult part become like this, because the words are totally opposite. So you do the opposite thing, and then you do the break thing, then you achieve the white thing. So basically that's the difficult part. And they use the couplet, 3 couplet, great observation. Yeah, that's the difficult part. When I work on the translation, that's the most difficult part.
Thank you, Jason. Next up is Phil.
Yeah, I was admire the use of the multiple translations. Since I'm an artist, I believe in poetry, and and I'll tell you something that somebody taught me that was very interesting. about Moses and the Ten Commandments. Of course, that's very important in the Hebrewic tradition as well as the Christian tradition, that Moses went to the Mount Sinai and God gave him the edict, and that was the beginning of the laws that became the Torah. But when he came down from the mountain, he saw that everybody was worshiping the golden calf. That's actually the decisive moment, not when God was the burning bush and all that kind of stuff. Because he got so angry that he threw the 10 Commandments down, and the 10 Commandments actually cracked and fractured. And within those cracks, it allowed for the disordering of the letters. Therefore, it allowed for interpretation. And the Hebrewic tradition not only venerate the Torah, but there was also a tradition of the Talmud of interpretation, which means you have to be very involved with hermeneutics and interpretation. And so that's, I think, while that works very well for poetry and maybe even for discovery of the unknown, I wonder whether that works well for building a bridge. To hire a bunch of poets and say, oh, I'll do it this way. Well, first of all, we have no idea what he means really, specifically. And plus, there are many, many views about how we should attach one thing to another. So we don't know. So I think there is a tension there, even in terms of interpretation, which on the one hand opens up possibilities. I applaud that. I really venerate that and applaud that. But in terms of functionality, and that applies to government, you have to make a decision. And I think when you get too spiritual and metaphysical and an applicable world, then it may fall apart. It may be a different thing. So that's always a tension between knowing and not knowing, and the in-between of the two, and even in hermeneutics. So therefore, in a sense, it becomes a problem. And I think when you get too involved with poetry, and I am involved with poetry in that sense, then in a sense you forget about the other thing. And I think you might walk away and say, oh, just let Confucius handle that. I'm like a little too deep for this kind of stuff, right? And so then the power constructs a hierarchical structure that is able to build a bridge, but it could be very oppressive in the way it is, because it doesn't allow for enough openness to create other possibilities. So that's the tension we live in. And I think when you walk away from that responsibility that a city has, a civilization has, which is different from either the material nature as well as the living nature, then in a sense, you're forgetting about civilization has a unique need to answer those questions as well. So you always are treading on that line, right? Let's deal with the known, and let's also not forget about the unknown. And if you forget that tension, that's what the problem is. Once you fall into one or the other is incomplete. You have to have both in order to exist in a more complete world.
Wow. Phil, that was amazing. That was amazing. So I want to comment on two things. One on hermeneutics and one on kind of the American version of this problem, okay, the Western version of this problem. On hermeneutics, for example, just like you mentioned, Torah, even in the Middle Ages, like people like Aquinas, there is this tradition of conversation, of hermeneutics. And if you look at what we are doing right now with the text, we are doing oral hermeneutics. We are looking at the text. Then there are all these people who have translated it or really interpreted it. These are, 10,000 translations, not really 10,000, but many translations and many interpretations. And we are all doing our own interpretation and talking to each other about it, considering what the other person is saying. And that process is what is needed to grasp reality. So it's not text itself. You can't put your faith in text. It is text combined with this. These are the deepest thinker on this is Walter Ong, and we've done 3 meetups on this. So if you go to our YouTube channel and search 52 Living Ideas on YouTube channel, and we've done 3 meetups on Walter Ong. He talks about this dance between the written and the oral, between the digitization and specific systems and in language, and this flow of conversation between people that keeps it alive. So this is at the language level, but let's look at it at the social level. Our founding fathers came up with a very ingenious solution. If you look at the Constitution, it's a structure which allows for change within it without it breaking down. Previously, people would, thought of it in terms of either it's you follow the entire structure, hierarchical structure, and the king will tell you what to do in a hierarchical way, or there is state of nature, and people would kind of say, oh no, I can't stand this, so let me go back to just nature, right? What the founding fathers are doing is that they are identifying in the preamble core things that an individual needs, and then they're building a structure that makes such life possible, and they're making the structure full of checks and balances, and amenable to pushes and pulls at every level, so that it remains, so there is living force that continuously impinges on the structure to keep it alive and keep it responsive for nature, for living things. So it's the same kind of problem. So one at the political level, one at the language level. So yes, Phil.
Yeah, just a brief continuation. I wonder, for instance, when God gave the laws, whether he knew, supposedly he knew everything, he knew that Moses was going to break the tablet, okay? And so therefore, if he knew, then was that an apology for having entrapped them in eating from the tree of knowledge? And this tree of knowledge allows them, man, to, in a sense, have, how should you say, freedom or identity to participate in the creation. And so was that God's apology, or was that simply Abraham's mistake? It's very, very interesting.
Wonderful. Thank you, Phil. Always appreciate your comments. Just very deep. Next up is going to be Lisa, Andrew, and David. Lisa.
Yes, I'm wondering if Lao Tzu was really an anarchist because of the way people are grouped together in a non-hierarchical collective. So I don't know whether anarchism is actually a practical solution to the problems we have today. But it seems that Lao Tzu is most in line with that way of solving human problems. The human ecology might work best in an anarchic grouping.
Thank you, Lisa. Jason, you'd like to comment on this?
Yes, I'd like to comment on this. I think Lisa, you make a right point, because some people really talk about Lao Tzu is an anarchist, okay, because the early anarchist. So he talked about the ruler, just a symbol. They just sit there and do nothing. Okay, the words will do nothing, and everything will be in order. Okay, so remember the warring state. All these philosophers try to resolve the problem. So they say, because you intervene too much, that's why you cause the problem. If the ruler stay behind, sit in a high position, do nothing, then everything will be ordered. So you are right. It's anarchist, and the early anarchist.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Andrew, followed by David. Andrew.
Yeah, hi, just a couple of thoughts. I'm looking at Stephen Mitchell's interpretation, translation, And one thing I'm noting here is in some places, things can appear to be poetic, but when you kind of look at them carefully, maybe they're just breaking a sentence apart, literally, or almost just defining a term within one sentence. I'll give you the first here. The Tao is infinite, eternal. Why, line 2, why is it eternal? Line 3, it was never born. Line 4, thus it can never die. So that all sounds very kind of poetic, but really those 4 lines are basically defining what the word eternal is. I just think that's kind of interesting. Sometimes you can get caught up in the what seems to be poetic, but you're just kind of breaking some definitions down. Another thing I thought of is, you know, there's no right answer, right? That's why I have all these interpretations. And when we read some of these things, we're also trying to make sense of them. But how can we do that? We can only do that with our prior knowledge, what we already believe, right? We don't have new information at our fingertips. We're just looking at this and trying to make sense out of it. So for that reason, some of the meaning we get out of it that we're able to kind of bring forth is really just a manifestation of things that we already believe, and maybe we're seeing them written in a certain way, and you kind of realize, and you hear people saying that, you know, basically saying, what does this mean to me? Well, it's kind of like, this is what I already believe, and this is now a way for me to kind of express that. So I think that's interesting. When you look at this, it's possible that in some sense, there's like nothing new. It's just kind of like, because you kind of see what you want to see. So maybe this is when people read this, maybe it's look at it as more revealing as to what your current beliefs are, that this is actually not new information. Something to think about.
Thank you, Andrew. Jason.
Yes, thank you, Andrew's comment. And I think that's very interesting. First thing, I talk about second thing first. Second thing, you talk about nothing new. Okay, so same thing like I said, the anarchist. Okay, so basics. The problem is you interfere too much. So knowledge, you knowing too much. Just like if you look at you absorb too much junk data. Okay, and make you unknown. So I think that's the same kind of idea, because if another thing you already know, you receive a junk data and you think you know, but actually it just covers you up. So that's the idea. And your first comment about a poetic comment, I think that's very interesting. And that's not, I don't want to mention this because nobody talk about this. I believe nobody pay attention on this. I pay a lot of attention on the logic, how it write it. If I read the Chinese for the first 3 lines, it reads like this: 天长地久，天地所以能长久者，以其不自生，故能长生. That's very long, but the translation always do like heaven and earth is not living for itself. Why? Because it can last, it's not live for itself. The reason is that at that time, Chinese lack of the concept like why. Okay, that's a simple word. So basically have to repeat itself. It said the heaven and the earth can last for a long time. Heaven and the earth can last for a long time. What's the reason? The reason is, that's why it becomes so lengthy. Okay, because they logically lack the concept of why until the Buddhism bring to China. That's my own observation. That's why this translation usually is shorter in Chinese but become longer in English. But in this chapter is different. It's longer in Chinese but much shorter in English. So that's a thing I pay attention, but probably not everybody interested. So.
Thank you, James. Jace. So I just wanted to say one thing. I mean, what Andrew is talking about is the confirmation bias, is that we come to everything with our own ideas. And we tend, if we don't watch out, we tend to actually just see what kind of confirms whatever is there in our heads. One thing I would say is that actually engaging in a discussion like this is a way of countering it to some extent, because if you are actually going to listen to the other person, now that's a very difficult thing to do. Most people actually don't listen to people. They are just trying to listen to themselves, their own reaction, emotional reaction to whatever is being said, in which case they are just looking at whatever is there in their own head. But this gives you an opportunity of there are so many people, they're reading the same thing, and they're actually coming at it, if you hear them closely, from all angles. So that's the best kind of a solution to the problem. The fact the confirmation bias will not go away. But this allows you a way of countering that if you are going to actually listen. So thank you very much. Appreciate that. Next up is going to be David, Zach, and Kevin. David.
Yes, thanks very much. I noticed a difference in the way that Jason described the second part of the couplet twice that reminded me of something. I mean, in nature. I mean, because it's interesting in the way that many of the translations sort of talk about, okay, the sage puts himself last and he comes out first, and this and this. It's sort of a different structure to this. Whereas Jason once in his translation, I think, mentioned leader, and what it reminded me of is that in wolf packs, actually, when they're traveling, the leader or the alpha is at the back of the pack. So it's actually led by, I mean, the lesser ones and the sick and the infirm are in front, so they keep the pace, but it's actually the alpha of this hierarchy that is at the back of the pack. And so it reminded me in this poem, and at the time, I mean, this was discussed thousands of years ago when they had much more knowledge and understanding of nature. And I was, I know not curious, but I mean, thinking of how much this is maybe a subtle hint to their own observation, that this is not so much, okay, if you put yourself last, you will come out first. This was a more of a factual statement that the leader is at the back, that the leader places himself at the back, and that's how he's able to lead this entire group. And so, I mean, a different perspective on that middle part of this chapter.
Excellent. Thank you. And at various places they talk about, the leader following the people. So you're kind of saying, okay, everybody is going this way, and I'm going to, understand where they are really wanting to go, and
Well, more so that specifically the alpha, I mean, the leader is actually directing the pack from the back. It's not following the pack. I mean, he's actually directing where the pack goes. He's deciding it, but he's at the back to protect the back, to protect the flank, to protect the back of the pack and where the danger is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether it maps exactly like that, but very interesting. Thank you. Next up is Zach and Kevin and Phil. Zach.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on something Andrew said as well. So I think a book like this, it's trying to get across a different kind of knowledge. I think of like the Donald Rumsfeld, like, there's the known unknowns, then there's like the unknown knowns. So something like a documentary, like I watched a documentary last night and I learned that Julius Caesar's wife had a dream the night before Julius Caesar was murdered that he would be murdered. So that was like a new piece of information to me. And I know that I'd never heard that before. So it was a piece of information that was unknown to me that became known. Whereas I feel like reading this book, a lot of what this book and maybe texts like this are trying to do is uncover things that we already know. So it's kind of like, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the Platonic idea that like all learning is remembering, which I don't know, I guess maybe I would disagree with that. I would say like, I don't think I, knew that Julius Caesar's wife had this dream and then, relearned it. But in some sense, like a lot of the things in this book I think what it's maybe trying to do is like uncover some things that we already know or have already heard. Because a lot of these things, have been said so much that they have become cliches almost. But, every now and then somebody puts together a string of words that just like resonates and clicks something in our mind that kind of just is this kind of like, oh shit moment where, we have this kind of like breakthrough or epiphany. And to me, that doesn't seem like new knowledge. Like I just gained a new fact that I didn't know. It seems like I just became conscious of something that my unconscious already knew. So I don't know. It is an interesting thing though, because I had a lot of the same thoughts as Andrew. So to be kind of meta about it, I didn't realize that until he said what he said. And then it was kind of like the epiphany happening. But yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Zach. Next up is Kevin, followed by Phil. Kevin.
Yes, thank you, Frank. Just I listen everyone. One is from Sun, from Korea translation. C is treat if you treat two part or third part, three part, treat the first part use sky and earth. That's a school from our human being. Think about our human life about this 100 years for everyone. That's long enough. How about sky? How they exist? How about the earth? It's unimaginable. Our human being not exist, right? The earth already exists. So from that long range, think about it, then it's, let's see, one commentator says non-hierarchical, practical. That's in the chapter 1, and the first couple chapter already land out of this chapter. In Dao, not consider this single individual, not just that, consider human being as whole. That's everything is like whole picture, yin and yang all together. It's really different of what we currently practice in modern practice, self-centric oriented. And yeah, I like the nature is a school. We learn from nature. Then another level is a sage, a wise man, or people definitely have something good virtue. We follow it. And the third level is ourself and our relationship with, let's say, self-centric or self-actualization. I'm going to steal the word, Jason. That's a good word. Say self instead selfish. Then compared to selfless. Then that's one sort of experience. Then when I help other people, I can offer something. I'm happy. That's my value kind something. If when I do myself, I didn't pay attention. It's like in other words, we take for granted so long as human as whole. It's generation by generation. We think get better. We lost our foundation. And like Madeline posted totem poles. And look at the pyramid in Egypt. It's all foundation. It's so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's okay. Next up is going to be Phil. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to thank Andrew because what he said was very important. It's not that I've never heard of confirmation bias. Of course, I know it, but he shined a light on it that was a little different. So it immediately made me think of Plato, right? Of course, Plato, the problem might be that it was mimetic, because we're just remembering things rather than going into the future. Everything is in the past. That's one problem. But it seems to me the juxtaposition of those words that are a little bit askew, which means like Moses' crack in a way allows interpretation, but the jarringness of it, in a sense, does the thing of, you could say, either shake some of the cobwebs and dust off so you could see the original clearer, which is confirmation bias. But you could also look at it the other way. And that two-way look is kind of interesting because it allows you to also say, no, what it really does is to jar the eternal forms a little bit, so it's now not like square, it's a little jostle, and that really is deconstruction, right? So what is this juxtaposition doing? Is it knocking things off so we could clearly understand, oh yeah, now I remember, yeah, you know, I thought that all along, right? Or is it more like, oh no, like the thing is shaken a little bit. I mean, it's not totally destroyed, but it's like completely juxtaposed. I remember an artist that was very interesting, who, this would be in the 60s, he did this piece in which was made of half silver glass. You know, you could see through it. And he balanced it just right so you could see through it. So a bunch of people looking at it, it's just very simple, but it was very effective. When you looked at it, it was hard to tell, in fact, almost impossible until you turn around, whether the people that were standing next to you was across the room or behind you. It was like, so suddenly you have this, it's not like a regular mirror of mimesis where you sort of like, you know, Narcissus sees himself, of course, like, well, there's me, how wonderful. But you see the other and you don't know what the hell they are. It was that juxtaposition of space suddenly gives you like, oh man, like I never thought space was like this. It was very interesting. It allows you to see something differently. Imagine even space is, there's a possibility it could be something different. So I really appreciate that juxtaposition, that it could either be mimetic or, you know, transparent or semi-transparent.
Excellent, Phil. Great observation. Again, another great observation. I want to kind of look at it in terms of art. I think great art does this. So for example, Leonardo, what he talked about his paintings was that he says, my paintings are traps. Like, I want people to focus on it. Like what happens is, like when you look at Leonardo's paintings, the most common reaction people have is that they're mysterious. Because as your eye moves through it, it actually shows you kind of different relations. And by the time it comes back to the same place, something has happened to you, all your observations. So you see the same thing in a different way. And you kind of take a double take on that. And he actually designs things that way so that they remain, you know, and that's really the power of art, where it is actually in a static thing. It is making you think so much. It is making you make all those identifications. And this is a work of art. That's what it is doing. Look at, we've been talking about this for almost 2 hours. And it keeps giving, you know, so thank you. Next up is going to be Amon, Kevin, and back to Phil. Amon.
Thank you. I just wanted to support what Zach was saying about reading this and having this experience of, oh, these are my thoughts put into words, because I had that same experience with my first encounter with the Dao De Jing well over 25 years ago. And what Phil was saying before about this relative to Plato and the idea of remembered knowledge, there's a different epistemology that's at work in this tradition than there is in the Greco-Roman tradition. And the easiest way I can probably put words to it is that for someone like Plato or Aristotle, knowledge was a captured thing, like a mosquito frozen in amber. It was something static that once it is known, it is known. There was a distrust of that kind of claim of knowledge within the Taoist tradition in particular. And there's more of a subtle wink and a nod that knowing is something that can be. And we have that experience of knowing all the time, but it is a phenomenal experience that moves with time. As soon as you try and look back, you don't know, but you can be in the process of knowing in a given moment, because we all have a similar experience in a similar realm of being on this planet. We see a lateral horizon in front of us. The sun rises above our heads. So there are foundational natural phenomena that give us a foundation to rest our feet on and say, okay, I have a knowing that that is so, even if I have no words for it, or if words don't necessarily encompass it or enshrine it. Whereas the Western tradition really tried to be very pedantic and didactic about what knowledge was. Phil was talking about how this was a bridge built by a poet, but there is advice in here, and it's not completely up for relativistic interpretation. There is no way to read this verse 7 and say, oh, Lao Tzu is condoning selfish acts and, miserliness and hedonistic lifestyle. There's nothing of that in this verse. He has a very clear admonishment to be modest, be humble, work from the back. Don't try and put yourself forward and be up front. And that is the role of a sage or a leader. There's also his idyllic society, which he talked about, a village that's just within barking distance of the other dogs that you never go to, because it's this bucolic, wonderful thing. And he does it in just a couple of terse lines, whereas Plato wrote the Republic to expand and lay out this very particular idea of a utopia, which still never seemed to be quite as utopic as Lao Tzu's idea of a simple village life.
Wow. Eamon, how do you pronounce your first name?
It's Amon. You've gotten it right a few times.
Amon. Amon?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, Amon, that was brilliant. That was brilliant.
Well, thank you.
It is, this West is very different. Western epistemology, Western way of approaching things is very different than the East. And it is important to keep these distinctions in mind, because in some ways, it's like opening up the entire tradition, and it comes from a very different source. The Chinese tradition is very different from the Western tradition. Indian tradition is very different from the Chinese tradition, and it is very different from the Western tradition. So you kind of have to work to understand it on their own terms. And you did a very good job of kind of describing, kind of differentiating it. So like, for example, the Western tradition is very explicit, and it privileges kind of explicitness, clarity, definitions, systems. The Eastern tradition is very much close to nature and percepts, and it privileges intuitions, and it is more suggestive rather than denotative. It is connotative, and it is actually suggesting you many things, and those kind of come together. So it's a very kind of visual, right brain kind of a tradition. This is kind of more of a sequential left brain kind of a tradition. It is, Western tradition is more focused on, it drives relentless towards precision, whereas the Eastern tradition drives relentlessly towards kind of this holistic, almost a holistic feeling, something like that. It's a very vague way of describing it, but the distinction that you make, I think, is critical.
I do think those Western presuppositional views are what most of us bring to looking at a text like the Dao De Jing, because we are in a Western society. I don't think anyone here is, phoning in from Taiwan. However, if the same sort of critical referentialness was brought from the East to a Western text like the Republic, I have no doubt that any good Taoist worth their salt would take one look at it and say, what a blabbermouth, and be done with it.
Yeah, I want to say that there are many, many, many of us here who have enough of the West, enough of the East in them. So for example, I grew up in East, so I have the core of tradition, which was, though I'm very much of an American, the core of the base was formed in India. And that is true for several of the people here. So that's one of the advantage of this, is that, and it's both ways advantage. Like Jason was commenting that he read Dao De Jing as a teenager, and he kind of, he thought he knew it all. But then later on with experience and then with conversation, he kind of discovered how much there was to discover. So I think this conversation between East and the West has enormous potential, because you kind of need both. You need kind of the intuitive, physically grounded in kind of experiential kind of a base that the East has. And you need the precision, you need the words, you need the ability to name. So it's wonderful that we can actually be doing this. Next up is going to be Kevin, Joe, Madeline, and Phil. Kevin.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Actually, couple days ago, this Sunday, I can remember the one is the danger of a single story that actually tried 1 minute up the food. I'm gonna waiting list didn't attend. I want to, from another perspective, once loses attention, want to for this book, Dao De Jing, and another for our estimate for translator. So I'm very interested, whoever translate, where's the source? That's word by word from Chinese, or it's from another, let's say, own kind of taste. That's all good. I would say if let's see whoever interested, because we got so many translations, maybe which one, what's the original? Whoever interested, I can use point out there was very specific word give to you. By the way, I'm going to show you one website. It's you can use Google Translate. Have got the kind of feeling about it. This is Chinese, pure Chinese. However, you can put a Google Translator. You can translate something, then you can pick out any word. That's better understand. Have a story. Have a estimate from the to some years, and some years ago people have interpret. Yeah, that's I just can't try figure out, contribute something if it's whoever needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I mean, I look at it as all of us are trying to interpret the Tao, the nature, including Lao Tzu. So it's like all of us are in the same boat of trying to do the interpretation of what the nature is, how it operates, and what it means.
So I'm going to post the Dao, the single word with Kojak's.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Joe, followed by Madeline. Joe.
Yeah, it's funny this weekend, in a conversation with someone, I was actually, it was, as a comment about what I thought, kind of the world needed, and I thought about justice and started talking about certain virtues that may be lacking in today's society. And it was a very Western way of looking at the world. And it's Iman actually just kind of conjured up a lot of that, a lot of my thoughts, in that you kind of look at knowledge differently from a Western perspective, as it is something to be acquired or captured. And we do look at it like a systemic, within a systemic format in the West. But the interesting thing about the Tao that I've picked up on this, and a very important thing, is not only the idea of being humble, but the importance of inaction, of non-action in that process, because that teaches us patience in addition to the idea of acquiring knowledge. And that's that's how East and West can kind of come together. It's the ability of nature to come to you and to be like water, versus actually going out and building a reservoir. I'm just making something up, but focusing on the particular. So this is something that the Tao is kind of slowly is I'm starting to see, is the power of inaction and patience as much as it is action. And I think that if you can marry those two concepts together, it's kind of the yin and the yang, and it's balance in a way. So anyway.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Madeline.
In its inception, Taoism grew directly out of the native local animism. And when the whole world is alive, things aren't fixed. Knowledge isn't a particle that can be taken in by the organism and stored. And there was also, I've actually had so many thoughts this evening, I'm having trouble organizing them into a few sentences. There was also the belief that everything was in motion. And as we discussed, someone made the point recently that this was written around the same time as Heraclitus was writing. The belief that everything was in motion, and also that water was created by mountains, because streams came down from the mountains. There was fog and mist in the mountains, rain clouds came from the mountains, and the belief that the entire world was in motion actually got transmitted to the West along when porcelain came along and got imported, along with some of the Chinese ideas about the earth and the earth in motion. And that's how the Scots first got the idea of plate tectonics.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Next up is Andrew, followed by Phil. Andrew.
Just something that came to mind. You know, there's so much in the Dao De Jing. There's a lot of focus, like Joe just said, about being patient, maybe downplaying, or it's keeping your ego in check, roughly speaking. And I just wonder, is it possible a lot of what we're seeing is actually words to the masses to kind of keep quiet, so to speak? You know, could it be partly about that and not so much about true spirituality? It's more like, everyone, just listen to me. We need to hold the masses and the millions together and keep peace. Go with this program.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up, Phil, I'm going to give chance to everybody to speak, and then we'll come to you, okay? Because people who have not spoken much, I want to give them chance so we get many more thoughts on the table. And I love to hear you, but I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance. Alvaro, followed by Phil.
Yes, I just wanted to make 2 comments.
Alvaro, can you speak into the mic?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, I just want to make 2 comments with regards. Maybe I'm looking at the text too much from a Western perspective, and I am using 2 different translations. So the 2 I'm basically taking from each one of them, and they do not seem to convey the same. But I believe we can see some self-interest in the sage, if we want to. At least I can say it. So, for example, in the last 2 lines, as per one translation, it says, "Is it not because he has no self-interest that he's therefore able to realize his self-interest?" So instead of looking at it from the perspective of the sage not realizing his self-interest, or I would like to highlight the fact that he's realizing his self-interest. So there is a motive for him not to have self-interest. And that may show that he is indeed not as selfish as we think. So he's just acting according to his interest and just acting just to get what he wants at the end.
Okay.
And then
thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make yet another comment, and it is regarding the wolves and the pack. And there is one line that I think describes it really nicely, and it is, "The sage is highly esteemed because he regards himself as the least important." So when the alpha wolf puts himself at the back of the pack, just as the sage is regarding himself as the least important, we can have somebody, or we can have high esteem for somebody who does that, but it's stepping down from a position of privilege to one that is not of privilege. But if somebody is not in a position of privilege and is not being selfless and making himself, and is selfless and is making himself less important, most likely the pack or a group will not have a lot of respect for that. That person needs to come from a place of privilege, which makes me think that the sage is in a place of privilege and wants to remain in a place of privilege. So from that perspective, I don't think it's being that selfless.
Thank you, Alvaro. Jason, you had a comment.
Yes, I think Alvaro also make especially he talk about the last. You talk about the last sentence about like he's selfless, and actually the word by word is not selfish. So you can be selfish if you translate word by word. So I remember last time, is that Michael or somebody talk about is read as irony, like it can become a legalism, you know. So actually, some people read as a legalism of Machiavellian, you know, kind of thinking. So you want to be your ultimate goal is be selfish. So you have to act unselfish. So you can be, you know. So you stay behind. So you can turn out. You can lead. You have to detach. So you can have everything. So if you read opposite, you know, opposite way, okay, that's a do this one. And I think I mentioned last time, the Chinese legalism, Han Fei basically is a good leader, a good interpreter of Lao Tzu, Dao De Jing, and he reads it totally opposite way than most of people read today. You know, so you know, that's not unusual. So.
Thank you, Jason. I would encourage people to actually try to read this on its own terms, because its way of approaching things is so different from the West that it's very easy to read the West into it and interpret it in a very different way than how the Chinese thought is. So I think I strongly recommend actually reading this kind of, you know, it's like the whole thing, and that multiple times through multiple translations. I've put the link to this. This is my favorite one website by far on this. It has 10 different translations, and you can choose any 5 of them to read in parallel. So you can actually get at, and you can switch between them. So you get to read, you know, anything. And I would recommend reading it. I would also recommend hearing it. It's a completely different, you know, mode of trying to take it in, and just let it sink, and then try to, you know, speak, you know, to try to kind of interpret that. Let me see. There are people muting. Sun, did you have something? Nope.
I do.
Yes, go ahead.
So I just want to add that we cannot see it. This is very paradoxical, but we cannot understand it as linear. It's not a self versus selfless. There's a death included too. And also it's a reading and understanding is important, but we have to experience it and practice it in our real life to understand more closer to the author. Or so yeah, that I just wanted to add my understanding to it.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is Elena, followed by Phil. Elena.
It's so I just joined later, but I'm just catching up on the discussion. And what appears to me, so that the word selfless, it's interpretation from the source, right? And we think, oh, it means it's someone who is not an egoistic, who has no desires and such, but there is another meaning, another way to dissect it or to perceive it is that it's just when you remove yourself, your personality, your history, your who you are, like say you are non-existence, and look at it from that particular perspective, and then you don't see whatever you are looking at from the point of view of who you are, because we have like say stagnant views that or in points and how we perceive life based on how we grew up and who we are, and then suddenly you see that from the perspective of who, like entirely different. So selfless meaning remove yourself and lead and just it opens up entirely new perspective then. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Elena. Great observation. Next up is Phil.
Yeah. 2 quick comments before I go to telling you another work of art. One is that just to defend West, you know, you have to read Heraclitus, because that was an opportunity lost. And you will understand the Tao better if you read that. And in fact, it had that in Heraclitus. The second is that Andrew is the true anarchist, because if we accept Lao Tzu as an anarchist, then he is like flinging it back to Lao Tzu by saying, you know, like, couldn't this just be read as like, keep the guys quiet so that, you know, they don't cause any trouble? And like, I think that's an anarchist statement. In fact, what he did was even more than that. He did the kind of Vanna White thing, and can go ahead and take a look at Confucius. he'll do the rest of the talking. But I want to get to a point about this artist. He's a conceptual artist, a Black artist. He doesn't do any art per se, you know, make an object. He was given permission in the Virginia Historical Museum to do a project with the existing stuff that was there. So he found, just on this, not the spur of the moment, but he found in the museum some old portraits of of the landowners, and of course many of them have illegitimate children, among them Black children, and they were actually included in the painting, but they're way in the back and not well lit. All he did was hung these paintings, and instead of shining the light on the white landowners, he shined the light on the Black kid. And it completely changed the story, and you saw what was hidden. So even in the precise statement that the landowner wanted to say, because they were, I guess, to a certain degree, honest enough to show the other thing as in the background, it completely changes. So therefore, in a sense, criticizing something, even when it's said, could be said differently if you put the focus at a different place. It was just a wonderful thing. It's completely exposed a new history that people should see.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Phil. So folks, this is excellent discussion. I mean, I don't know. I think we're doing something really, really amazing here, because every time I read the poem myself, read the chapter myself, and then come here, all this discussion is it just adds so much richness. So let's do one thing in kind of closing. If you want to just say in a couple of sentences, what are you getting from this process? You know, what do you like about this process? Just very briefly, I want to get, you know, your feedback. I mean, I am very, very thrilled with what is going on and how much I'm getting. I think my understanding of Dao De Jing would be at a much lower level if it had not been for these conversations, but I want to get your feedback on it. So if you would like to talk about what you're getting from this, just go ahead and type an exclamation mark. And let's try to be brief so we can wrap it up in about few minutes. So go ahead, if you would like to say what are you getting from this, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Let's start with Joe. Joe, go ahead.
I'm getting exposed to Eastern culture and actually learning to change my thoughts and see the world in a different perspective. So I find it to be immensely helpful. I mean, it's transforming actually. So I think it's a transformation that I feel I'm getting out of it. I also really like the way we're going through it very thoroughly and getting so many different perspectives and so many different translations. I find that to be extraordinarily helpful.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe. Next up is Elena, followed by Phil. Elena.
I'd like to say that I'm so grateful for everyone's perspectives and everyone's interpretation. And Shrikant, you're doing an amazing job with having it becoming a reality, this group and all the discussions. And it's I try to come with an as empty mind as I can, because if it truly you get so many ideas that I would not come up on my own, or I would not see it from however who I am right now. And yeah, so that's why it's truly it's great. It's just great.
Thank you, Elena. Appreciate that. Next up is going to be Phil, Jason, and Mike. Phil.
From the text, I like the ambiguity because there's a lot of interpretation. But from the meetings, I like the various interpretation. I particularly like Andrew because he's like being whacked in the head. And suddenly, well, you're jarring like, oh, okay, there's something actually quite different. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Phil. Next up is going to be Jason, followed by Mike. Jason.
Yeah, I just noticed when I show up and we only read one chapter. If I'm not here, you read 2 chapters. I just try to figure out. So I try to be quiet today, and you still read only one chapter. So I'm not sure what's going on, and that's the thing I try to figure out. And I think I become more and more follow Dao De Jing's teaching, and I think speak less and listen more. And then I find out every body's comment, they all give me new meaning. Even I claim I already knew the meaning, but every time people speak, either spoke, and even I speak, I find a new meaning. So I think that's very important. And good job.
Thank you.
Keep going.
Thank you, Jason. Next up is Mike, Maritza, and Kevin. Mike.
Yeah, there are so many positive things I could say, but one thing that I found very interesting is how much I enjoy hearing the Tao in other languages. I first learned most of the Taoist principles from a Korean Taekwondo master. And when I heard Sun speak today in Korean, it just brought back so many memories. I am not fluent in Spanish, but I understand enough. So when Mauricio is speaking in Spanish, and even when I hear it in Mandarin, I'm not sure why I feel like I'm understanding this, but I am. It's just part of the Meetup group that I particularly like. It's very, very cool.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Maritza, followed by Kevin. Maritza.
For me, I'm with you, Shrikant. I feel like, this group helps me just like understand it so much better. I'm like, oh man, can I read all my books this way? Like I get such a deeper understanding of it just from all the perspectives. Also, I feel a little bit like I get to know the rest of you a little more, like because these are poems, a little bit of each person comes out when they speak about what that poem means to them and how they interpret it. And so I feel like I'm by the end of this journey, I'm gonna feel like I know all of you intimately, which is kind of beautiful.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is Kevin, followed by Brian. Kevin.
Yeah, maybe so many interests maybe inspire me spend time. I'm going to use it 5,000 words. I'm going to each word get one link. Click it, one English come up, Kojax. Yeah, they get maybe I can put my best choice, put another column. Let's see, that's my word. Then people get own kind of grasp, play the puzzle, get a better understanding what's the original intent to do, what's the best estimate from own.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. Really appreciate this. Next up is Brian.
Congratulations to Shrikant. I think you've really hit on a great format for this book. I'll say, just point out, we've had different formats for different books, and the others have been great too. So this is working really well for me.
Excellent. All right, folks, thank you so much. And we will see you in a week. Bye,
Thanks, everybody. Thanks,
See
everybody.
ya. Bye.